Rome was the greatest city in the world, yet everything that made it powerful could also make it vulnerable. Imagine walking home through the city's noisy streets late on a warm summer night with music from taverns echoing between tall wooden buildings. Nothing seems unusual, yet in the space of a single moment, the future of the empire is about to change forever. That is the chilling truth behind the Great Fire of Rome. By the summer of 64 AD, Rome was bursting with people. Apartment blocks called insulae were packed so tightly together that neighbors could almost reach across and shake hands through their windows. These towering structures creaked under the weight of entire families, shops filled with fabrics and oils, and merchants storing grain. The district of Subura was famous for its nightlife and excitement, but also for its lack of safety. Fire was always a threat. Many Romans whispered that Emperor Nero cared more about luxury and performances than the practical needs of his people. The city felt like a spark away from disaster long before any flame appeared. They just did not expect the spark to arrive that night. Before we continue, make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. Fire starts at the Circus Maximus. A normal evening near the Circus Maximus suddenly became a nightmare. Merchants closed their stalls and families began to settle into sleep while lamps flickered through narrow alleys. Then in the southeastern corner of the massive stadium, flames began crawling upward through the wooden shops that surrounded the horseshoe-shaped arena. Tacitus would later write that the fire erupted with terrifying speed before anyone understood what was happening. Wind rushed down the long valley of the Circus Maximus, as if the stadium itself was blowing on the fire. Smoke poured upward, and sparks scattered onto rooftops. People awoke, choking on fumes, while ceilings collapsed above them. Those who ran into the streets found only more flames blocking their escape. The blaze surged up the Aventine Hill, swallowing markets, homes, and memories. It was as if the night had been waiting to erupt all along and finally seized its chance to unleash chaos across Rome. Flames spread across ancient Rome. No one could believe how fast the disaster spread. The fire seemed to hunt the city rather than simply burn it. 7 of Rome's 14 districts would eventually be destroyed. 2 more would stand badly wounded. Temples and ancient shrines that had stood for generations now faced heat so intense that marble cracked and statues crumbled. Cassius Dio later described stones exploding like eggshells bursting over coals. As the flames moved forward, strange stories began swirling. Witnesses claimed to see unidentified figures spreading embers or blocking escape routes. Maybe thieves were trying to loot homes in the confusion, or maybe people imagined enemies in the billowing smoke. Yet these stories mattered because they fed a question that would soon transform rumor into legend. Was someone driving the destruction on purpose? Mothers carrying children crashed into panicking crowds. Families jumped over burning debris, desperately trying to outrun a fire that seemed to already know every shortcut. The city itself felt alive and cruel as it turned from a home into a trap. Emperor Nero and the fire. While the fire raged, another drama was unfolding miles away. Nero was not even in Rome when the first alarm sounded. He was at his villa in Antium, where he spent time away from the capital. As soon as messengers reached him with word of disaster, he hurried back toward the burning city. The Rome he returned to was unrecognizable. Nero immediately ordered public spaces, like the Campus Martius, opened to provide shelter for refugees. Buildings constructed by Agrippa were made available to the homeless. Food was rushed in from the port of Ostia, so survivors would not starve. He even let people camp in his own gardens. These actions revealed a ruler who tried to help his people survive. Yet the city was still burning, and sorrow can easily twist into suspicion. The more Nero attempted to restore order, the more citizens wondered whether he was hiding something dreadful. 6 days of destruction in Rome. Day after day, the fire showed no mercy. Romans fought back with buckets of water and desperate slogans of hope, while everything they loved collapsed into ash. On the 6th day, the flames finally retreated. Exhausted families knelt among the ruins of their homes, believing that their agony had finally ended. They were wrong. Without warning, a second outbreak ignited near the luxurious gardens of Maecenas on the Esquiline Hill, or possibly near the properties of the powerful prefect Tigellinus. Survivors stared in disbelief as fresh towers of fire devoured what little had been spared before. The shock of watching fire return was worse than the original horror. When that second blaze finally died, the heart of Rome was transformed into a wasteland of smoking rubble. Survivors looked across the devastation and realized the city might never look the same again. Did Nero burn Rome? With half of Rome destroyed, survivors found comfort in finding someone to blame. Nero became the target of suspicion because people already feared his ambition. He wanted Rome to be grander. He dreamed aloud of redesigning entire districts in his own artistic vision. Some even claimed he wished to rename the capital Neropolis. Words once spoken in pride now sounded like a confession. Rumors erupted saying agents of the emperor had deliberately started the flames. People said they saw men stopping citizens from saving their homes and spreading fire instead. Every strange act became evidence. When stories circulated that Nero watched the inferno while performing music inspired by the fall of Troy, the gossip gained a cruel new life. Suetonius and Cassius Dio later repeated these tales with dramatic flair. Even if the stories were exaggerated, the damage to Nero's reputation was complete. Romans who already disliked his taste for Greek performances assumed the fire was just another one of his theatrical scenes. The scandal grew until truth and rumor became impossible to separate. Political enemies also found opportunity in the chaos. Senators who wanted Nero removed could point to the tragedy as proof that he was unfit to rule. They whispered about his building dreams, suggesting he had burned the old city to create space for his new empire. In a world where power often depended on public perception, Nero had already lost the most valuable resource of all. He had lost trust. Whether Nero ever commanded the flames will forever remain uncertain, but the theory survived because so many Romans believed it. When a population already feels ignored by its ruler and suddenly loses everything they own, the easiest answer is to assume the ruler wanted that loss. In that moment, conspiracy feels safer than chance. The question, did Nero burn Rome, still echoes because doubt spread faster than fire itself. The fire and early Christians. Nero needed a way to turn anger away from himself. In a city grieving and furious, he searched for a scapegoat. He turned his attention to a new religious group that was already considered strange by many Romans. The followers of Jesus gathered quietly in homes and refused to worship the gods of the empire. They shared their meals and welcomed outsiders, but to those unfamiliar with their customs, these secret meetings appeared dangerous. After the fire, Nero accused the Christians of starting the destruction. Arrests followed. The historian Tacitus described punishment so cruel that even some Romans who disliked Christians felt sickened by the spectacle. Christians were torn apart by animals in public arenas. They were crucified on wooden beams as crowds watched. Some were tied to posts at night, coated in pitch, and set aflame to light Nero's gardens. The emperor turned suffering into spectacle to convince citizens that the guilty had been found. The tragedy of this moment extended far beyond those who died. The persecution gave early Christianity a legacy of martyrdom that shaped the identity of its followers. Many later traditions hold that two central figures of the faith, Peter and Paul, met their deaths in Rome during this wave of terror. Their suffering became an example of unbreakable faith. The city tried to silence them with fear, but instead gave them stories that would spread across the world. Romans saw Christians as outsiders before the fire, but now they saw them as victims or as symbols of resistance. The attempt to destroy them helped them endure. Ironically, the ash of the Great Fire became soil in which Christianity's future influence would grow. Nero rebuilds Rome. When the last embers cooled, Nero looked upon a city that needed not just restoration, but reinvention. He issued laws requiring builders to use safer materials like brick and stone instead of flammable timber. Streets were widened so people could escape future disasters. Firewalls were ordered between buildings to slow the spread of any future flames. Water systems were strengthened, and storage areas for flammable goods were moved away from living spaces. These reforms were practical and sensible. Rome learned from its suffering and adapted. Yet while practical rebuilding began, Nero focused his energy on something far more personal. He ordered construction of a vast palace complex called the Golden House. This residence stretched from the Palatine Hill to the Oppian Hill and included gardens, fountains, and an artificial lake where his statue rose in colossal height. The architects, Severus and Celer, filled the interior with wonders like ceilings that rotated and rooms decorated with seashell mosaics. Light reflected off gold leaf so intensely that visitors said they could hardly look at the walls. Ordinary Romans stared at this transformation with disbelief. Their neighborhoods had vanished while Nero's pleasure palace grew. The same disaster that ruined their lives gave the emperor the opportunity to build a home more magnificent than anything imagined before. They felt abandoned as monuments to imperial extravagance climbed above their ruined streets. Every sparkling chamber of the Golden House reminded them of what they had lost. The seeds of Nero's downfall were planted in this resentment. Even those who once tolerated his eccentricities now saw a ruler who cared more about beauty than about the broken families living in makeshift shelters nearby. His palace became a symbol of arrogance, and symbols can topple rulers faster than armies. Ancient writers on the fire. Most of what the world remembers about the Great Fire did not come from eyewitnesses. It came from storytellers of later generations. Tacitus wrote decades after the disaster and tried to weigh the facts with caution. His version admits uncertainty even as he describes horrifying scenes. Suetonius wrote with a love for scandal, transforming Nero into a character in a dramatic story. Cassius Dio, writing even later, painted vivid images that influenced how future ages imagined Nero. Each historian shaped the past according to the concerns of his own time. Tacitus explored moral corruption among Rome's leaders. Suetonius focused on personalities and juicy rumors. Dio described events to illustrate how power and fate collide. Their accounts do not always agree, but together they create the version of history that survives. They turned the fire into more than a physical disaster. They turned it into a mystery that demands interpretation. When we read their work, we must keep one truth in mind. History is not only about what happened, it is also about what people believed happened. Belief can shape memory, and memory can shape legacy. The Great Fire of Rome lives on because writers kept its questions alive. How the Great Fire changed Rome. The Great Fire lasted only days, but its influence reached far beyond those tragic nights. Rome emerged safer, stronger, and with a modernized building code that would protect millions for centuries. Yet the fire also gave birth to new tensions. The Golden House tried to erase the ruins, but instead highlighted them. Nero's choices after the disaster deepened divisions that already threatened his rule. Within a few years, his enemies would drive him from power, and his own life would end with no throne to protect him. The spark that destroyed Rome may have also marked the spark that destroyed Nero. Christianity's rise also traces part of its strength to this catastrophe. The attempt to crush its followers forged resilience. When Christianity eventually spread across the empire, it carried the memory of those who suffered under Nero's blame. What was meant to silence them instead gave their message a voice that outlasted emperors. Today, the legacy of the Great Fire can still be seen beneath Rome's streets. The Colosseum, one of the most iconic structures in the world, stands upon land once occupied by Nero's lake. A monument to public spectacle replaced a monument to imperial indulgence. The city rebuilt itself not to honor the ruler who watched it burn, but to honor the people who survived. That transformation is the true final chapter of the fire. Rome rose from ashes, determined to never again let its heart be claimed by a single man's desires. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. See you in the next video.